Hello, I'm X Toycat and welcome back to episode 2 of the Toycat podcast. This is the audio-only replacement for the live streams on Tuesdays, also kind of doubles as Serious Sunday, because it has been requested by a lot of you, and it's going to be the fun thing we do for the next couple of weeks. By that I mean last week, this week, and next week. And episode 2, I wanted to talk about the biggest thing that always comes up when people talk about the news. Everyone tries to talk about how scary the future is, right? Like, the one thing you can get everyone to agree on, no matter what people do believe, is, oh yeah, things sure are going to hell these days, you know, they're getting way worse than they used to be, and, you know, like, I miss the good old days, or whatever, like, exact variant of those things. You can get people to agree that, like, yeah, things are pretty bad at the current moment, and you know why that's the case? It's not because it's true. Like, world as we know it, life as we know it, everyone as we know them are getting better and better on a regular basis. This is just, you know, facts that are hard to ignore. However, it's something that mostly, in my opinion, comes from the media and comes from the headlines that kind of define what our basic conversations about the world tend to be. Because if you don't know, how do you get the news? You read the news or you watch the news. But the problem is, over the last, you know, like 100 years or so, like even less than that, there's been this distortion where news went from shifted from being this kind of idea of like, oh yeah, news is news. You can read about what's happening and you can be more informed, to like, oh yeah, well the news can also cover that. But what if the news was an emotion machine? What if instead of just hearing about the most important thing today, you felt like you had to read a whole bunch of different stories? Or even worse, in my opinion, is this kind of serialization of news. Have you ever noticed how certain bits of news basically call back to previous bits? Like, oh yeah, following on from that story, this developing piece of news that will be covered for the next week. We've seen this in the UK where the exact same piece of news was being rehashed day after day after day because it was popular, not because there were any real developments in the, you know, the ISIS Gulf story, in case you're curious. But like, that's the sort of example of like, so news went from being this thing that was solely focused on news to that kind of being the secondary objective. It kind of turned into the emotion machine, and as it turns out, this is just universally true, the more negative emotions sell better than the positive ones. Think about it this way: it's easier to create an issue in someone's life and then fix that issue than it is to fix an issue they already have. It's easier to sell someone the outlet to their sadness, even if you're the one that's also selling the sadness. And yeah, I don't want this to be like a big anti-media rant, but I do want it to be like, why do I think that even though the world is getting objectively better, the amount of suffering every year, the amount of wealth increasing every year, the amount of all these different things that are just universally positive, even in people's own lives, the fact that that can be distorted and seem exactly the opposite, in my opinion, is, you know, solely down to the fact that, you know, certain news sources are like that. And I think that's changing. I think the fact that, you know, more and more people use various different places or social news, or, well, you know, like, you know, YouTube is a good example where it can be a really great way to actually get, you know, the real takes on the ground and get your opinions in a separate place. Then you get your news, which you can get in a separate place. Then you get your updates on the future or whatever. I like that those things can be actually split up on a platform like YouTube. And anyway, I just wanted to talk about, like, so, you know, even if you don't believe the world is getting better, you're like, well, Toycat, you know, even though you're saying nice things, it kind of sounds like you're going on a bit of an anti-media rant. I thought this was the Toycat podcast. We gotta talk about fun things and stuff, but it is something I wanted to really bring up because everyone disagrees with that. But I think, you know, it's a good example of like how this is true. If I told you right now that in your local area, your town, your city, your village, or whatever, there were two events happening. There was a really good dessert bar that had just opened up, and there was also a potential serial killer in the area. Which one are you more interested in? Which one are you more drawn to immediately? You're like, wait, why no one's caring about that dessert bar? There's a potential serial killer. Like, can I trust, you know, my kids outside? Or if you are, you know, the kid, like, can I trust myself outside? I don't know if children do think that way, but, you know, like, you know, that you have the big questions of like, oh my god, potential serial killer, even though, you know, like, notice there, one, potential, like, okay, so that there might be something there, like, oh no, there might be ghosts under your bed, better check it every night, you know, so like the potential bit's a bit of a dodgy one. But even if it's like a guaranteed serial killer, it's like, I mean, on a statistic average basis, it's like once a month strikes. That still means there's a lot of murders, but still, that's not how most people are dying in your given town. It's a scary way to die. I think a lot of serial killers are extra scary, but if it's just random, you know, you might die at some point, then, I mean, again, in a realistic sense, the one that's going to affect your life more is probably the dessert bar. Like, odds are, unless you're going out late at night and, you know, being defenseless by yourself, you know, you're probably not going to be a target for this potential serial killer. But that dessert bar, you know, how often do you eat dessert in a week? Several times. That might change the world. And, you know, to make a more, you know, a pressing example, what's more interesting to you, the new economic policy plans that are coming up, or or the fact that the new president might be impeached. You know, that's a news story that's been said all year, and everyone's convinced that every aspect is now a huge big deal worth being mad about and caring about. And yeah, by the way, just in case you're curious, the reason you should care more about the dessert bar than you do about the potential serial killer, you know, beyond the fact that, like, you're probably not going to get serial killed, is the fact that, man, dessert is really, really good. It's the best meal of the day. You know, it's something you only get a tiny amount of, so isn't it great when you can go and just dedicatedly eat it? And, you know, obviously there's, like, health concerns, but, like, eat a smaller dinner, have a smaller lunch. Now you have an amazing dessert. And you might be thinking, like, oh, so what's that, like, ice cream and maybe, like, waffles or something? You know, like, if you've been to an IHOP or is it Denny's, I think? Like, I'm trying to name American chains I like the dessert at. Like, man, that's, like, good dessert. Why do you need better stuff? I mentioned I love the Cheesecake Factory cheesecake in the last week's podcast. Like, oh, yeah, that's really good. Why do we need dessert bars? That's not necessary here. But here's the thing, right? There are so many desserts. You know, there is a dessert science going on at all times that you kind of discover at these places. Like, something called a bubble waffle. I think it comes in from Asia in some form, just because of the connotations of bubble tea. But, like, it's a waffle that is lots of bubbles connected by, like, tiny bits of strands. It's actually healthier because you're actually mostly only eating these weird bubbles that are mostly aerated anyway. But, like, have that with something else. It is a revolutionary new dessert. It tastes so good, like little balls of waffle, as opposed to waffle being the current shapes, which, let's be honest, kind of suck. Like, every food, in my opinion, probably would be better in a sphere. Like, there are very few examples where a sphere of, like, you know, any type of food would be better. Like, oh yeah, like, you know, vegetables sure suck, but here's a little sphere of it, chomp into it a few times, swallow, now you've eaten, like, a day's worth of vegetables. Oh, meat, wouldn't it be great if steak came in little spheres, and it'd be like, oh yeah, this is the ball of meat. It'd be amazing biting into that. You know, like, any sort of food coming in a sphere is an objective improvement, and the fact that at dessert places, you get multiple sphere types foods. You know, you get ice cream with those little scoops, you get bubble waffles, apparently, at least at my local places, and then sometimes they like to go real wild on, like, you know, extra weird things. Like, here in London, at least, I think this is probably any, like, let's call it trendy city around the world, you know, you've probably spotted something called a freak shake, right? That is a mind-blowing fact that, like, you know, we've distilled the idea of milkshake, you know, we distilled the idea of, like, an amazing dessert into a drink, which milkshake already kind of was, right? Like, you can get some horrifically bad for you but amazing tasting milkshakes. We've gone the whole next level. It's a milkshake that also comes with things you eat as you're going into them. It's like, we tried to work out how we could get the most calories per, like, 100 milliliters or whatever, and we did a good job with the freak shake. So yeah, dessert bars, you should care about them. Dessert is, again, I love dessert. Apparently it's like a key topic in both these podcasts. Maybe we should talk about something else next week. But no, so I wanted to go back, you know, in the same way that I think the thing that affects everyone, the things that can really change your life, should be more important than the thing that changes some, you know, far off scandal that's basically celebrity drama, is why you should also care more about, you know, in the US, for instance, like, oh yeah, who knows if that president gets, you know, impeached or not. Like, in my opinion, you know, not living in America, it's not the biggest of deals, even though pretty much everyone I see on any form of social media is like, oh, here's this hot new development, and it's like, oh yeah, well, if you really dislike someone, the opposite of love is often portrayed to be hatred, but the real opposite of, you know, love in reality is not caring about someone. If you really, really don't like someone, stop caring about them. Stop diving into all these sorts of stories. Things can happen, you know, there are legal processes and things, like, whether you know about them or not doesn't affect whether it's happening, and when you've been tricked 100 times about this being the biggest deal of the year, that's when you probably should stop caring. And that's why, if there was some brand new policies coming out of whatever's happening right now, that should be the more important thing. The thing that actually affects everyone should be more important than the celebrity drama, which it seems as though is what a lot of, you know, current day news turns into. Like, you just pick a target who can be human and therefore flawed while also being, you know, good in certain ways at the same time, and then you tear them down or you build them up, and that's how so much of the news these days goes. So anyway, similarly, while we're talking about that, I wanted to talk about, you know, because a lot of people are, you know, not focused on the good, and because of that, some of the ideas that we kind of like, you know, let's say collect as a society, because even though society is filled with different ideas, certain ideas come out of nowhere, they get floated, they get kind of shared around, and then sometimes they become the consensus. Like, you know, doesn't everyone agree that we shouldn't have terrorists in the country? You know, that's calling back to the earlier example, right? Like, oh yeah, no one likes terrorists, as it turns out. Everyone is pretty anti-ISIS. There aren't really many defenders of that. Kind of crazy how that one goes. You know, like, there's different ideas that are just universally accepted, and one of those ideas that I've been seeing it happen more and more, and I'm worried about, like the economic illiteracy of it is something that a lot of people say all the time as their criticism, either of like, capitalism as a whole, or, even just like of the current, like, goal of a lot of people. And it's like, infinite growth is not possible. And they're like, yeah, I showed you. You think infinite growth is possible? Well, it's not. Because, well, I mean, first of all, no one really ever assumes it's possible. No one's ever saying, well, we're going to make infinite more money next year than we did this year. Or like, in 10 years, we'll make infinite money. No one ever says that. A lot of companies try to grow at a pretty fast rate, but that's a pretty natural normal thing because of the way, companies bell curve out and the fact that, you always can make more money, especially in a economy where you make 0.001% of the total or something. So, there is more money for any individual player, unless you're the richest man on earth, in which case it's a lot harder. But even then, Jeff Bezos is, killing it every single year, right? His companies are killing it every single year. So, first of all, saying infinite growth is not possible is nothing anyone's ever gone after. But even if they did, like on an individual level, you can't go for infinite, but you can get pretty darn close because of just how much money is out there. In case you're curious, by the way, just the pure amount of cash that is found all around the world, just the physical notes and etc. that you can find, it's something like $5 to $10 trillion. If you measure it in dollars, or that amount in euros, or a little bit less in pounds. Like, there is a lot, there are trillions of dollars in the world, which, in case you're curious, that means like 5,000 billion just in pure cash that is circulating around the world. If you include the amount that is like, within like a savings account and within your checking account, your current account in the UK is what we call it, within all of these different accounts, what you probably have is somewhere closer to about 80 to 100 trillion US dollars. That's how much money there is in the world. So if you made, like 60 million and next year you want to make 70 million, actually not too absurd. It just means you gotta, get another 10 million of that pool, which, by the way, every year that pool is going up significantly. Even if that pool, though, was a fixed size, even if we never made more money, it would still be possible to grow at near infinite percentages. But the point I wanted to talk about today is not that, like, oh yeah, well, there's lots of money in the world, anyone can make some of that via different means, if you really wanted to, there's lots of things that you could sell that you're not selling that would give you more money and less things, and that's just on the individual level. You could, if you got a company, you could sell more products, you could, X, Y, Z, there's always ways to do more. It's just that sometimes those things take a lot of effort, or they're not worth the time compared to the things that do. Basically everyone has a finite amount of time, a finite amount of resources. Those are the things that determine how much, money your given company or person makes. The reason I bring that up, though, is because of the economic, just the pure staggering illiteracy of people who say, well, infinite growth is just not possible, Toycat. There is no such thing as infinite growth in the economy. Everyone always expects that the economy will grow at like 2 to 4% every year, or if you're China, like 8 to 10%, by the way. But everyone expects that the economy will grow at that percent a year, but that's not sustainable because 2% every year for a million years, it's not actually infinite. Like 2% for an infinite number of years, that's infinite growth, and you can't expect infinite growth, Toycat. And it's such a catchy thing that I see all the time online. I see people share this as if they've worked out the smartest thing, like, ha ha ha, did you know you can't grow something an infinite portion over itself? But here's the worst bit. Even though it sounds really catchy to say this, and even though you hear a lot of people say this, and even though no one's really ever like said that infinite growth was possible, you're arguing against a straw man, it's also not true by itself. That's what really bugs me about this. So just for a little bit of economics with Toycat, everyone's favorite miniature series that I think we did a tiny bit off accidentally during a villager thing, but let's talk about economics of Toycat on the growth thing, because if you don't know, the goal of every economy, at least if anyone like is in charge of it on Earth right now, is to grow and to increase the capacity. You might be like, so the economy, by the way, is the value of every good, service, etc., at least when you measure it in GDP, kind of combined. Like when you go to your work, you're slightly boosting the GDP because you're creating value for someone that then allows them to create value that then has like a knock-on effect. Basically, the collection of everyone's productivity as a nation and then as a world later combined is what the GDP of that country equals. In case you're curious, GDP is gross domestic product. You could probably work out that by itself, but I don't say it very often, and maybe I should, but GDP is gross domestic product, the amount created in a country as a whole. And then if you divide that amount by the number of people in a country, you get the GDP per capita. And this is why a lot of countries are a lot richer and a lot more productive per person. When you look at stuff like, Singapore, for instance, they don't have a huge economy, but they have a huge economy per person. They're one of the richest countries in the world. When you look at the US, it's both rich in terms of the pure amount, because there's 300 million people, and also one of the richest, but not like very, very top per person. And that's what makes makes the US the world's largest economy. The second largest, in case you're curious, is the EU, and the third largest is China, which isn't actually very rich per person. It's something like $8,000 per person, there, as opposed to closer to 50 or 60,000, depends on the exact numbers. But yeah, significantly more rich per person. But because there's a lot more people in China, that's why it's somewhat in contention, and it's widely expected that at some point China will pass the US. It's a matter of when, not of if, for the most part, because of the sheer number of people advantage. So yeah, now you know the very basics. Like, that's what GDP is. That's what it means. That's why there's two kind of different measures. And the reason I'm bringing that all up is because GDP rises every single year. There are some years where it doesn't. Those are called recession. That's where everything actually goes to hell, by the way. Like, in 2008, notice the number of bad things that happened there. There's a tiny chance, it's going to happen again in the next year or two. Like, we'll go down a little bit before going up significantly. But the general trend, the trend for any 10-year period, even during the deepest of recessions and the Great Depression even of the 1920s, like, even if you look at all of these things, it's still like, oh yeah, it still grows over time. And in case you're curious as to how that's possible, how is it that the US is getting richer every year? How is it that the UK is getting richer every year? How is it that China is getting richer every year, producing more every year? Because, funnily enough, last I checked, the world has a finite amount of land. Checkmate, all those numbers are lies, and it's because of inflation, or, make up some other things, because, I don't feel richer than I did 20 years ago. But, the realistic reality of that is the way, any form of economy works. The idea of an economy, which is just like, hey, we can trade goods for each other. So if I'm a lumberjack and you're a fisherman, I'm really good at chopping down trees, but I need both trees and fish, and you're really good at fishing, but you need both fish and trees. I'll chop down a bunch of wood, you do some fish, and then we can trade so that we both have both those things. As opposed to, if I'm a really good lumberjack, I'm probably not a very good fisherman, and vice versa. That's the basic idea of okay, so you trade your stuff, and now you've both done more productive things. You've boosted the overall GDP, you've done more as a whole, so now you both have more wood and more fish. And yeah, long story short, that's the basic premise of oh yeah, you trade things with each other, use your surplus labor, and you get more and more things done, because that can happen on huge countrywide scales of oh yeah, there's lumberjacks, there's fishermen. Can you think of all the job titles? You can't even think of 1% of the job titles. There are so many bizarre specific things that people specialize in, and that's what people have basically done. This entire time through history, we've specialized more and more and more, and that's why the GDP went from existing in hundreds of US dollars, even measured by today's standards, even 500, 1,000 years ago, to being literally 100 times that. That's why the gross value eventually ended up at almost $60,000 in the US, closer to 40 or 50 for Canada and the UK, etc. And the EU average is somewhere in that ballpark too. But oh yeah, that's how it got so high, because people slowly started to specialize more and more and more. That's the endless trend in humanity. And you might say, Toycat, why are you explaining all of this? This doesn't debunk infinite growth. You're just explaining economics in the most basic form. Well, here's the thing, right? Have you noticed how that's happened endlessly? If we've gone from 500 to 60,000, obviously the Industrial Revolution was the biggest time, the biggest increases we had, because we slowly got machines to start specializing too. So for every person, there also started to be machines helping out, and then that slowly turned into cars, which turned into combine harvesters and all these different things. So now how much wheat can a person farm? An entire farm, a giant huge farm, you can still pretty much handle with 5 people. Back in the the old ages, that would have taken hundreds of people, but now 3, 4 people, even 1 person in certain cases, can farm all of that stuff. Eventually it will be fully automated, so the amount of wheat made might require 1 person for an entire state or district or something. And you can see how so that means there's more wheat being produced by that 1 person, there's more value being produced by that 1 person, which means all of the other people are now doing something else, obviously assuming they're not unemployed. But again, unemployment rates aren't particularly high in most countries, so now they're doing other things, and if they're doing other things which are also similarly improving in pace, then they're producing more value per person too. But you might say, well, surely there's a limit to that, even though we've grown how many percent a year for as long as possible, because we keep inventing new things, because we keep increasing the amount that a single person can effectively do by specializing in different things. That makes sense, but surely there's a limit to that. You can't have 1 person farm all of the wheat on Earth, and even if you could, that's still a limit, right? But no, the truth is, you could have 0 people farm all of the wheat, all of the everything. All of the farming could be done by 0 people, because eventually you can have machines that deal with all of that. Think about those weird states in America where you're not legally allowed to put your own gasoline in your car. You have to have an attendant do it for you. As soon as they're gone, the amount of people required for that job went from how many thousands that was to 0. Yet the exact same thing is being achieved in roughly the same amount of time, right? And you could probably eventually like automate it entirely, right? So you just drive up to it and it like picks up the rack and does things. But like, oh yeah, so now all of those people who previously their job, their way of contributing to that large number that is our total output together, previously their way of doing it was via, pumping in these things, but now they're basically doing that job as well because it's being done automatically by them while also doing whatever they've done next. Basically, the idea of automation, the idea of increasing specialization, these two things together, they're kind of separate, but together are increasing, and one day it might even be possible. It's always the dream scenario, but again, we're talking like in that infinite far future scenario, eventually no one will need to be employed in anything. Like someone might need to check the robots, but what happens when you get a robot that can check the robot? Well, who needs to keep that robot in check? Well, eventually you can have someone that automates that. Pretty much every single job is automatable. It's just the question of what do we do until then. But the real tragedy comes at like, okay, so people are going to need some work. We might need to invent robots just to give people some work to do so that they don't get like kind of bored. Because a lot of people like working. A lot of people, when they hear about the idea of like, oh yeah, so switching out from 40-hour weeks to 30-hour weeks, it's like, that's kind of sad. I like doing a big piece of work a day and getting a fair piece of pay at the end. Like, there are some questions about how you deal with the end results of that, and I don't know these questions. I'm not going to debate this. This is like way advanced what we want to talk about, but the key point is that you can always get more and more and more for the most part. Like, there might be an end to that, but if there is, we have no idea where it is. Even though an infinite amount of growth might not be possible, and who knows for sure, if it really is, eventually down the line, can every person be, a trillionaire? I mean, but what does a trillionaire mean if everyone's a trillionaire? Like, there are basic questions like that you have to ask and answer that, like, we can't picture an economy that is post-scarcity. One of the key things that defines our current world is the scarcity of items. Every time you pick up a, like a bowl of cereal, that someone else can't have that. And even though there's so many goods that, like, there's a lot of spare capacity that, like, oh yeah, even if you do pick it up or don't, like, there's still going to be plenty of spare capacity, like, someone's still going to be able to get it. There are certain things where that's more true than others, and we live in a world where scarcity is real. Everyone has to decide what they want, and that's kind of what money allows you to do. Like, oh, I would like to have only all the Cheerios. I want 60,000 boxes of Cheerios. You can spend your salary on that if you want to. I don't know how much that would cost. Probably a lot more than a yearly salary, but then you don't get to have, like, diamond watches and, I don't know, like, whatever else, a nice car, because you spent all your money on Cheerios. You're like, like, the idea of that is something that is, but the amount that every individual is going to have should slowly increase over time. It basically does, and always has increased over time. Like I said, you always hear about these super negative stories like everything's going downhill. The only way to stop this is to do what we want you to do, which is to vote for X or Y or Z candidate. And it's like, no. Like, everything is getting better all the time. There are certain indicators that might be going down at any given point in time, but if you look at the vast majority that define how well a country is doing, most of them are doing really great most of the time. Again, especially if you live in a developed country. In the less developed ones, there can be really bad years, like, oh no, it looks like the Mugumbu has seized all of the corn and now everyone starves. Like, that might happen to you, but if you live in a well-developed country, that's not what's happening. The truth is, we are growing a percent every year, and it's a percent that grows on that percent, and because of compound interest, eventually that should equal infinite growth. We might be able to eventually get to post-scarcity. I don't know when, why, how that would even work. It's something well beyond the realms of current economics, but it's not something that really seems impossible, and even if it was truly impossible, even if infinite growth wasn't possible, it's not an issue that will ever take effect during your lifetime. We're talking about, like, questions that have to be raised in 5,000 years once we've automated everything, when in reality, the amount of jobs that need to be automated and be so much better done by a robot, and we still haven't done them. That's before the tricky ones, like, how do you get a newspaper to write itself? And it is entirely possible. Like, a lot of bots can do that, but how do you get, a bot to write a song? How do you get a bot to, like, go to space? And how do you get a bot to design bots that design bots? And, there's loads of different questions regarding that. But yeah, those are far off the future, because right now, if you go to most fast food places, it's still not automated. Even in the best case scenario, you can order with an automated machine and then someone brings it to your table. That's seriously the closest we've got. So real quick, look on your screen right now. This is audio only for the most part, but hopefully, assuming I'm not terribly forgetful, you should see on screen how I went to a place that just had a bullet train deliver your food. You didn't need to speak to a person the whole time you were there. I think there was one person who would deal with, like, you pay at the end and they'd introduce you at the start to how the whole thing worked. That can be the future. Like, having a person come over and deliver deliver things isn't a key part of the experience, in my opinion. Call me crazy. Having a person take my order is terrible because that means there's a good chance they might get it wrong. Whereas when a machine reads that order, and then if a machine is creating the order too, they can't get it wrong. Whereas, oh yeah, if I say Diet Coke, they might be like, oh, I bet he really wants, like a regular Coke or something. Like the amount of times you get tiny mistakes like that, not that it matters too much. Like, sure, I'll just drink the regular one. It's not the biggest of deals, but the fact that it would be better done by someone who would cost less and also would allow the person who's currently doing that job to escape into something else. I don't know, my point here is that there are kind of two dream utopia worlds you can create. There is the utopia you base on today where you say, okay, what we've got right now is the best we'll ever get. We'll never do better despite all the evidence to the contrary. Infinite growth isn't possible, therefore no growth is possible. Therefore we shouldn't expect any growth. If anything, we should expect contractions. It's only going to go downhill from here. You can have that pessimistic mindset, and in that case, I would see why you would be super negative and be like, oh man, we need to make as many things, paid for by other people as opposed to ourselves. Like, it is only fair if you have a huge amount of the total portion that will ever be generated. Like, yeah, Jesus, like, give some of that around. Like, use that to buy the things we all need. Or there's the view that everything is going up, and the reality of right now is we're going to look back on 2019. We're going to look back in this year and be like, holy Jesus, how do we used to live that way? Like, you know how we can't properly imagine, like, the future? Imagine trying to explain someone 2,000 years ago in a little Roman hut or a Saxon hut or whatever type of hut. Like, try to go back all those years to when people were just living in the same room as all of their family and they were lucky to eat, and being like, oh yeah, in the future, even if you're really, really, really poor, you'll still have food and you'll still have, a room to yourself, like an individual place for every single human. And also, you'll have access to a way to see the entire country. Also, you'll have access to some form of magic little brick that goes in your pocket that can entertain you and also call any other human you want at any given time. And also allows you to, again, there's so many wild things. And that's for the lowest level of our society. Like, take things up a few layers and realize, like, how much more, like, even the middle layer of society has than we had, like, all those thousands of years ago. And you realize that, like, oh yeah, if they'd decided right then that it's just not possible to have more than this. Like, this little hut right here is the best we'll ever have. We'll never have random boxes that allow you to listen to British people talk about economics. That's a pipe dream. This is the best we're ever going to have. That's what annoys me. I don't mind what you believe when it comes to, I mostly don't care about the ins and outs of politics. Like, I stay informed because I think, you need to be informed as an electorate, but, like, as far as, like, do I share my views? Do I talk about them for the most part? Not really. I don't think it's, like, my job to influence your role, but the one thing that I do think everyone should be on board with, like, a basic piece of knowledge that we've lost because it's so much more fun to be negative, is that, like, no, well, the one true fact of the world, I might even say, is that we're always doing better than we did before. The one true fact of humanity is we're always doing better, and I'm not just talking about, oh yeah, those GDP numbers are looking real good, because what does GDP mean if you're like, again, if you are one of the poorest 1%, what does the economic number matter? What do any of these things matter? Like, what matters are the things that really, really get to you. But even on any of those measures, like, you're way less likely to die to disease. You're way less likely to have a crime committed on you. Even though I had 2 things stolen from me in 2018, sorry. But, like, that's on the edge. The actual number of most crimes, especially violent crimes. You know how I said serial killer earlier? Have you noticed how, like, if you live in the UK at least, I haven't seen a serial killer in a very long time. That was a kind of a weird thing that just, like, the 80s, 90s had a big crime spike, and then we mostly dealt with it. Like, we saw a big issue as humanity, and then we kind of dealt with it. But the thing is, when mass murders are happening, it's in the news every day. It's a continuous story. They're realizing that these deaths can be milked non-stop, but when it gets fixed, there's never a news story saying, hey, we've actually mostly fixed the murder problem. It's like, oh, but now you've got to be scared about this thing. And I think that attitude isn't good. I think you should be hopeful, not for the world as a whole, although also for the world as a whole, but also for yourself as a person. Once you start to believe that everything's going really badly, you can start to believe that, like, oh, it's fine if I do too, but you can be what you want to be. I think it takes a very long time to get to an age where you're basically locked in. Like, even at age, like, 50 or something, you can still entirely reverse the direction of your life. You can be what you want to be. You can be great, and don't let people try to tell you the opposite. Don't let people tell you that everything's awful and you should just give up, because that's their mindset. You don't need to make it yours. I really hate when people try to, like, drag everyone down with their imaginary view of the world, because it's imaginary. Like, it's against all the basic things. By the way, also, just in case maybe you liked that so far, I'd recommend, as just a fun little thing, that, like, if you really like the science of how small actions affect big groups of people, if you really, how things cost the way they do, etc., etc., economics is a really fun subject to study. There's a lot of subjects, at least in the UK, that you never study in school, and then they come up as options, is what they're called here, where it's an optional extra subject you can study, where you can specialize into them or whatever. And economics was one I picked because they forced me to pick a fourth one. Actually, in case you're curious, just real brief thing here. In the UK, you have to pick at least 3. They're called A-levels to do. And then you can do a 4th one, and some people are crazy and do a 5th or a 6th one. But you can pick up to 4, but you need a minimum of 3. And the reason you need 3 is because your best 3 are the ones that your university of choice will take off you, your college to translate for Americans. So I was like, I'm just going to pick 3. I'd rather do 3 well than do 4 poorly and get the best of those 3. So yeah, my plan was to do 3. I did 3 for my first year and just didn't show up half the time though. So when I went to a different college, they're like, you have to do 4. We're going to force you onto 4 things, and if you don't show up to one of them, we'll kick you out of all 4. And I don't know how true that was, but the threat did keep me in there, and I was good at maths and economics, in my head at least, was linked to maths in some way. Maybe because of the movie about John Nash, A Beautiful Mind, which, by the way, love that economic theory too, game theory and blah blah blah, really good stuff. But no, to bring this back, it's oh yeah, so economics was just even though I had a terrible, I think she was probably a good teacher, but she was terrible as terrible person to interact with. I had this teacher called Z. She was from China. She said it a lot, but I don't think she was. I think she was probably Singaporean and just got bored and started saying she was from China. But she's like, in China is not that way. 8% growth every year. What are your excuse? What are your she was super adamant about stuff like that. And I don't know, it's really interesting because it's one of the few science-based subjects. I think it might even be considered a social science, but it's one of the few science-based subjects where there's really 2 giant separate schools of thought. You learn about what the problems are and you learn about what the solutions, the most basic level solutions. But when you get to the complex problems, the way you come up with those complex solutions kind of turns into 2 schools of thought, which is mostly what makes the 2, different political schools of thought when it comes to at least the informed side. I mean, obviously there's going to be people who just really popular messages it's the current system that's running everything. But I really like it as a subject that basically gets everyone on the same page of what the problem is, and then how you solve it is the thing that you disagree on. Whereas right now, what is the problem in the world? If I just asked you, if you ask strangers that, what are they going to say? And I don't think anyone knows. Everyone they always there is one. And that's the scary thing that comes from the news. You'll mention something in your personal life, because everyone, your beliefs are kind of tied to your person. The way you perceive the world is through your own eyes, so it kind of makes sense. But it's also kind of interesting to switch gears the tiniest bit, to hear people talk about influential people. There's a group of people called influencers on the internet, but I just mean influential people as a whole, which we'll just call influencers for now to get things confusing a little bit. But everyone always likes to talk about how influential people are, but never believe that they themselves are influential. And I've always wondered why that is. It kind of goes back to what we said last week, where everyone believes in the power of the individual, but not the individual themselves sometimes. And a lot of the times that's the world around you that's telling you to believe that. But a similar example of this comes in the form of ads, right? Everyone thinks that they're immune to ads, but yet ads are still profitable. The way ads work, at least a good ad, is you show your product to enough people, and then some of them want to buy it. It gets a little bit more psychological for the current layer of ads, I would say, where you try to associate the values of your product with the values of the customer, and then when the customer's looking around, they'll be like, oh yeah, well this product probably matches my values because of how that ad went. It's a bit more confusing, and you get several layers deep when it comes to advertising, where you then get companies where the whole advertising idea is just let's make customers believe we advertise everywhere. We're such a big deal, we get away with advertising literally everywhere, and then they'll think, wow, they're so big, I want to buy the leading brand, and then they'll buy it that way, which I think has to be the strategy behind Coke at this point, right? Think about Coke. They don't need to advertise to you. If you like Coke better at this stage in your life, you probably always like Coke better. If you like Pepsi better, you're not going to change your mind because you see that Coke sponsored some sporting event, but yet somehow they they justify spending hundreds of millions every year. And it's one of those big questions of are they doing that because what are they doing that for? There's got to be some next level marketing that just isn't understood by most people on that one. And it proves the point again that oh yeah, you might think when you see a Coke ad you're immune, but clearly you must not be, or they wouldn't be spending hundreds of millions on absurdly, ridiculously tiny ad placements. And yeah, I guess I think ads are actually a good thing. I think when they're well targeted, they're a good thing. Like if I receive ads for makeup, there's not much I can do with that. If I receive ads for, many different things I don't care about. But if I see a new game, like there are so many things I wish I had seen an ad for, because that's a good way to learn about new things. If it's targeted, it's a thing that you might actually really be on board with. Like there's so many things that, I wish I could see ads for. Because in case you are curious, I'll be honest in saying this, like even if you watch an ad block, like even though you're worth 0 on like a monetary level, like it's cool to watch the videos. Like I'd recommend turning off the YouTube. That's actually what I do with my own personal ad blocker, because one, it's like only 5 seconds of ads most of the time, and even on videos where there's like the guy's like, I'm just gonna put 50 ads in this 25-minute video, which is a thing you can do. I think the minimum spacing is only 2 minutes, but like basically because of that, like yeah, you can turn it off on individual videos. But I actually really like seeing YouTube style ads. I think because they're aimed at a similar demographic to you, because they're aimed at you personally, like they worked out based on what you watched, what you might like to see next. I actually see pretty interesting ads a lot of the time. Like I learned about Trivago. It's a meme how much they advertise. Like blank 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 Trivago, ha ha ha. That's high quality memes. Going right there, but like it's basically a meme, and that tells me that they probably went too far. But I will tell you, I was looking for something. So my family are doing something this Christmas, and they're doing it. It was absurdly expensive the way they're doing it, but I was like, man, it can't be that expensive for like Mexico too. Like Mexico's like a cheap country, right? Over Christmas, like there must have been something wrong. Checked it on Trivago, was actually significantly cheaper than everywhere else. Cause I wouldn't have known to do that last minute like check if I hadn't seen one of those ads. There's lots of examples where like actually, yeah, ads can be helpful. Even the annoying ones sometimes can tell you about a product. Because the interesting, again, it kind of goes back to the economic thing. My theory on this is like any product that's so good at selling, that so many people want to buy, that they have, surplus profits, they have extra money lying around just to promote their product, they're probably pretty good. Again, there are big exceptions to this. There are so many bad actors and bad things that, prove the exceptions that prove the rule almost, but I think it is kind of interesting. Also, while we're talking about ads and YouTube, I guess we should talk a little bit about the Adpocalypse V2. It's everyone's scariest event, and I think this is a really interesting story. So just a little bit of, I'll be the news teller today. There's a tragedy on YouTube. Everyone is dying because what has happened is YouTube has been displaying ads on videos which are not good for various different reasons. It's scary, it's terrifying. Some of these videos are just the worst, and YouTube is putting ads on them. How dare they run ads against them? Us, the responsible news network, care about every single ad on our platform, and definitely are not doing it based on the, the amount they pay us. We definitely try to care very intuitively. Yeah, that's everything's terrifying. So the real story here, by the way, is that YouTube, one of the most technologically illiterate things that somehow has managed to run through the news, and even YouTube has to respond to it because everyone just believes it, is that YouTube shows ads before the video based on the video, and that they sell ads for every individual video. One, there are billions of like videos on the internet, including this one. Do you think a YouTube executive is like, let's watch this and let's determine an ad? No, it's based on you. You were going to see an ad before this video, if you were going to see one, and you saw one regardless of what the content of this video was. This video's content is irrelevant to the ad that played before it. They're separate streams, separate videos, separate everything in every single way, except because, again, maybe an executive is being willfully, misleading, or maybe he's like, I just think it must work that way because that's how our ads work. They're like, wow, there's these terrible videos. The first time actually was ISIS propaganda, I think, and now it's just all these other sorts of videos. They're like, these are so awful. Why are Coca-Cola you running your ads against this? And Coca-Cola says, so we're not. We buy ads from YouTube. YouTube says we're not running ads in that. But like, they don't have to give the money to the people, and like, it doesn't need to be in the end. Like, does there have to be some minimum space between any ad and any form of bad content? Like, what happens if I am like, if there's a Coca-Cola, logo on the pitch and I, urinate on it? Have I ruined Coca-Cola's name? Should Coca-Cola pull out that stadium deal? No, because that's what the end user is watching. I really liked the days when social media was this unrestricted platform where you could post what you wanted, and then if you were the one posting things wrong, you'd get banned. Nowadays, like, looking at that stuff is making you the bad person. Like, it shouldn't, when there's something bad out there, it's kind of natural that humans want to see it, right? People should be punished. People should have the money taken away from them if they post things that shouldn't have ads on them. But the actual response seems to be, oh yeah, we're just going to censor content a little bit harder. That's what the under review kind of thing was. Like, oh yeah, any bad words or like gun looking things, or like, there's so many different just filters are things that are considered not good, not okay. That we've gone from a world where, oh yeah, you can upload everything, and then, YouTube was the amazing platform where you could monetize anything. If people wanted to see it, they could be the monetary backer for that. Like, you'll view it, basically, it was kind of like, like a Patreon, except funded by ads. Which is why, in the modern day of YouTube, so many creators have to be like, well, that doesn't work, because we post things just on the edge of what YouTube determines is okay, and that's why so many creators have their Patreons or whatever. And I always resist the urge to create a Patreon just because, it would be extra money, and I do like the idea of having more of that. But it is a thing that's like a real fear out there. Like, you're relying on ads, which means you're relying on both YouTube and the whims of advertisers. And now, apparently, because of the way the media goes, and because the media feels threatened by YouTube, because whenever they decide that, oh yeah, we're having a slow news day, let's post about a video that has bad ads on. When you have billions of anything, there are going to be bad examples. Imagine if, there was another species out there, because there are also billions of humans, right? And they're like, oh, so I have all of these billions of humans, notice how one of them is a serial killer. Wait, no, even better. One of them is potentially a serial killer. And they'd be like, well, we better kill all humans, because, look, this one's a bad guy. This is a bad serial killer, and therefore, we can't associate ourselves with that race, and therefore the best thing to do is kill them all. Imagine how absurd you'd find that. But that is really how things are now dictated on YouTube, and the reason it came about is purely because of this end-old thing of like, well, really, what news has turned into, most news, there are good news outlets out there, that I could recommend. Like, read a nice balanced, diet of, like, check out your, if you want to check out your crazy far angry news, check out the other side. If you maybe check out like a state-funded but also known as pretty good, like a BBC and Al Jazeera, like, there are good sites out there that are mostly dedicated to news, but the way bigger ones you hear about all the times are the ones that have turned into fear factories. Their entire thing is, here's a thing and here's why you should fear it. Here's a thing and here's why this is so unjust and why you need to fix things by, feeling bad about it. Like, the news has become an emotion machine, and I don't like that personally. I like talking about the issues and talking about the actual future, like the crazy things that can be possible if we all know, if we all believe, if we all try. That's what, the things you should be excited about. That's what I prefer. That's why on this that's why on this channel, for the most part, there are so many like weird negative little things that I try not to cover for the most part, because the exciting things are the things I care way more about. So, like, for instance, like the $8 texture pack, I could have made a video each day after that one, and people would have been like, yeah, we're so angry about this guy trying to charge $8, because first of all, he removed it from the marketplace, and then I think he said he was going to decrease the price, but like slowly, so it's still the most expensive. Like, there's so many little updates to the story that, like, we could have made each one to its individual video, could have been this big, angry, updating story, but it's not what I want to do. It's not what I think is the most important piece of news that day. I think we're going to cover it in a updated news video. In fact, I think we already probably did cover it in a news video, like when that happens, like officially, because I spoke to the guy behind closed doors. But like, you get the point of like, yeah, I think making people angry for no reason isn't useful. I think anger is one of the least useful human emotions, and maybe now you think that too. Or maybe you don't think that at all. But either way, I hope you all enjoyed this week's podcast thing with Toycat. I really hope that I went back and added the footage of the train thing. If I didn't, it's on Twitter. You can just Google, like, I don't know, Toycat sushi train. I hope you all enjoyed whatever we saw in the background too, and I hope you're looking forward to episode 3. If you want to see more of these Toycat podcasts, if this is something you really like, if we're being honest, it's not popular on YouTube. To be, like a well, recommended YouTube video, you need to be something which, like does well when it hits the homepage. And this is something that, again, like, it's not an exciting thumbnail, it's not an exciting title, and it's like 40 minutes. Like, who has time to watch that? These videos aren't going to do crazy well, but if you do want to support this, then you can hit the join button on YouTube and let me know that you did it because you like the Toycat podcast. And also, if you buy YouTube Premium, it's something I recommend because I guess you can skip the ads. You get like access to stuff anyway, but also it means that your watch time determines how much you're worth as a viewer, which means that things like this, for instance, are rewarded better. So yeah, pick up YouTube Premium if you want to support other long form stuff you watch as well. But also, if you just want to, help out your favorite creator a little bit more, that's the way that you can do it. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this week's Serious Sunday that's on a Tuesday and is a live stream replacement. And I look forward to seeing you in the third and final one next week when we record that. So yeah, it's going to be a third Serious Sunday. It's a trilogy, if you will. And I hope I see you there. Have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.